My name is Helen Giles, and I am 80 years old. For over 50 years, I have carried a secret that has weighed on my soul like a stone. I was 19 when I walked through the gates of St. Mary's Convent in Ashwood, Pennsylvania, my heart full of hope and my spirit burning with devotion to serve the Lord. I believed I was answering God's call, that I was stepping into a sacred life of prayer, service, and spiritual fulfillment. The black habit felt like a blessing on my shoulders, the morning prayers like conversations with heaven itself. But what I found within those holy walls was far from godly. What I experienced in that place of supposed sanctuary shattered my faith, broke my spirit, and left scars on my soul that took decades to heal. The men I trusted to guide me spiritually became my tormentors. The priests I looked up to as servants of Christ used their power, their authority, and my faith against me in ways that still make my hands tremble when I speak of it. For years, I stayed silent. I buried the truth deep inside, convinced that no one would believe me, that speaking out would only bring more shame upon myself. I told myself it was my burden to bear, my cross to carry. But silence, I learned, is not golden when it protects those who harm the innocent. Silence becomes complicity, and I refuse to be complicit any longer. This is my story. This is the truth about what happened to a young woman who wanted nothing more than to serve God, and instead found herself trapped in a nightmare of manipulation, abuse, and betrayal at the hands of those who claimed to represent everything holy and pure in this world. It is a story I should have told decades ago, but fear kept my lips sealed. Today, at 80 years old, with more days behind me than ahead, I finally find the courage to speak. I was born in 1945, right here in Ashwood, in a small house on Maple Street, where the scent of my mother's apple pies would drift through the windows every Sunday after church. My parents, Margaret and Robert Giles, were devout Catholics who never missed morning mass and said grace before every meal, no matter how simple. They raised me to believe that faith was the cornerstone of a good life, that serving God was the highest calling anyone could answer. Growing up, I spent countless hours kneeling in the wooden pews of Sacred Heart Church, watching the colored light stream through the stained glass windows, listening to Father O'Sullivan's sermons about love, compassion, and sacrifice. I memorized every prayer, every hymn, every verse that spoke of dedication to the Lord. When other girls my age were dreaming of marriage and children, I was dreaming of taking vows, of wearing the habit, of spending my life in service to something greater than myself. St. Mary's Convent sat on a hill overlooking our town like a fortress of faith. Its stone walls had sheltered nuns for over a century, and everyone in Ashwood spoke of it with reverence. The sisters who lived there were respected, admired, seen as living saints who had given up worldly pleasures to walk closer to God. When I told my parents at 17 that I felt called to join them, tears of joy filled their eyes. They saw it as the greatest honor their daughter could achieve. I spent 2 years preparing, meeting with Mother Superior Clara Evans, studying scripture, learning the prayers and customs that would shape my new life. Mother Clara was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul. She spoke softly but carried herself with absolute authority. When she finally accepted me as a postulant, I felt chosen, blessed, as if God himself had reached down and touched my life with purpose. But what I'm about to tell you happened within those sacred walls will challenge everything you think you know about holiness, about trust, about the very people we're taught to look up to as moral guides. The pain I'm about to share with you isn't just my own. I've learned over the years that my story echoes the experiences of other women who walked those same halls, who trusted those same men, who suffered in that same silence that nearly consumed me. If you can, please leave in the comments where you're watching this old lady from. It warms my heart to know that my voice is reaching far, maybe even places I never had the chance to visit. And if you like my story, please leave a like and subscribe to Grandparents Archives to help us achieve our first 1,000 subscribers. It helps us to keep sharing meaningful stories like this and makes our voices heard. The day I entered St. Mary's Convent was September 15th, 1964. I remember it so clearly because my mother had sewn a small cross into the lining of my suitcase, and she whispered a prayer as she handed it to me at the convent doors. I was nervous, excited, overwhelmed all at once. I had packed only the essentials: a few photographs of my family, my worn copy of the Bible that my grandmother had given me for my confirmation, and letters from friends wishing me well on this new journey. Mother Clara met me in the entrance hall, her black habit rustling as she walked. The convent felt enormous to me then. High ceilings, long corridors lined with religious paintings, the smell of incense, and floor wax everywhere. She showed me to my cell, a small room with a narrow bed, a wooden desk, a crucifix on the wall, and a single window that looked out over the town below. "This will be your home now, Sister Helen," she said, using my religious name for the first time. The sound of it made my heart race with joy. Those first weeks were everything I had imagined and more. I woke at 4:30 each morning for lauds, spent hours in prayer and meditation, worked in the convent garden pulling weeds and tending to the vegetables that would feed us. I scrubbed floors, washed dishes, helped prepare meals alongside the other sisters. The routine felt sacred to me, each task a form of worship, each prayer a conversation with the divine. I became particularly close to Sister Agnes Moore, a woman just 2 years older than me who had joined the convent from a farming family outside Pittsburgh. Agnes had gentle brown eyes and a laugh that could fill a room, though we were rarely permitted to laugh freely. We would steal moments together in the garden or during our brief recreation periods, sharing stories about our families, our hopes, our dreams of the religious life we were building together. The priests who served our convent were held in the highest regard by everyone in Ashwood. Father Michael Dunn was the head priest, a man in his early 40s with graying temples and a voice that commanded attention during Mass. He had been at the convent for nearly 15 years and was beloved by the congregation. People would travel from neighboring towns just to hear him preach. When he walked through Ashwood's main street, shopkeepers would nod respectfully, children would quiet their voices, and mothers would point him out to their daughters as an example of godly living. Father Thomas Reed was younger, maybe 35, with dark hair and a quiet manner that made you lean in to hear what he had to say. He had joined the convent staff just 3 years before I arrived, and he seemed especially devoted to helping the younger sisters with their spiritual development. He would often volunteer to lead our evening prayer sessions and would stay after to answer questions about scripture or religious doctrine. For the first few months, I felt like I was living in a state of grace. Every morning brought new opportunities to grow closer to God, to serve others, to become the woman I believed He wanted me to be. I threw myself into every aspect of convent life with the enthusiasm of someone who had finally found her purpose. When Mother Clara praised my dedication during our weekly evaluations, I felt a warmth spread through my chest that I interpreted as divine approval. But as autumn turned to winter, I began to notice things that troubled me, small details that didn't quite fit with the holy atmosphere I had expected. Father Michael would sometimes appear in areas of the convent where priests typically didn't go, the kitchen during meal preparation, the laundry room when sisters were working alone, the corridors late at night when we were supposed to be in our cells for silent prayer. When questioned about his presence, he would always have a reasonable explanation, checking on repairs, delivering messages from Mother Clara, ensuring our safety. I remember one evening in November when I was walking back to my cell after Compline, the final prayer service of the day. The corridors were dimly lit, and most of the sisters had already retired. Father Michael appeared from a side hallway, walking quickly, his face flushed. When he saw me, he stopped abruptly and smiled, but there was something in his expression that made me uncomfortable, a look I couldn't quite identify at the time, but now recognize as the gaze of a predator sizing up potential prey. "Sister Helen," he said, his voice warm but somehow too intimate for the late hour and empty hallway. "You're dedicated to staying up late for extra prayer. I admire that devotion." He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne, which seemed inappropriate for a priest who had taken vows of simplicity. "Perhaps we could arrange some private spiritual guidance sessions. I believe you have great potential, and I'd like to help you develop it." I thanked him politely and hurried to my cell, but the encounter left me feeling uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. When I mentioned it to Agnes the next day during our garden work, she grew quiet and looked around to make sure no one was listening. "Be careful around Father Michael," she whispered, pulling weeds with more force than necessary. "Some of the older sisters have warned me about spending time alone with him. They say he takes special interest in the younger ones." I asked her what she meant, but Agnes just shook her head and changed the subject. That conversation planted a seed of doubt that would grow larger in the weeks to come, though I tried to push it away and focus on my prayers. I told myself that Agnes was just nervous, that perhaps she had misunderstood something, that surely a priest, especially one so respected and beloved, would never do anything inappropriate. Father Thomas began requesting private meetings with me in December. He would approach me after evening prayers and ask me to stay behind to discuss my spiritual progress. These sessions took place in a small office adjacent to the chapel, a room I had never been in before. It contained a desk, 2 chairs, religious books lining the walls, and a single lamp that cast long shadows across the floor. During our first meeting, Father Thomas seemed genuinely interested in helping me grow in my faith. He asked about my prayer life, my struggles with certain aspects of religious discipline, my hopes for my future as a nun. I found myself opening up to him, sharing doubts I had never voiced before, moments when I felt distant from God, times when the strict schedule felt overwhelming, fears that I wasn't worthy of the religious life I had chosen. "These feelings are completely normal, Sister Helen," he assured me, leaning forward in his chair. Every religious person goes through periods of questioning, of feeling inadequate. What matters is that you continue to seek guidance from those of us who have walked this path longer than you have. But as our meetings continued, something began to shift. Father Thomas would ask increasingly personal questions about my life before the convent, about relationships I had with young men in Ashwood, about feelings and experiences that seemed to have little connection to my spiritual development. When I appeared uncomfortable with these topics, he would remind me that complete honesty with my spiritual advisor was essential for my growth as a religious person. One evening in January, during what had become our weekly sessions, Father Thomas asked me to kneel beside his chair while he prayed over me. This wasn't unusual. I had participated in similar prayer rituals with other priests and nuns. But as he placed his hands on my shoulders and began to pray, his touch felt different, more lingering, more personal than the brief formal touches I was accustomed to during religious ceremonies. His hands moved from my shoulders to my head, his fingers running through my hair in a way that made my stomach clench with discomfort. I kept my eyes closed and tried to focus on the words of his prayer, but I found it impossible to concentrate. When the prayer ended, and I opened my eyes, Father Thomas was looking down at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, intense, hungry, completely unlike the gentle spiritual guide I thought I knew. "You have such beautiful hair, Sister Helen," he said quietly, his hand still resting on my head. "It's a shame to keep it hidden under that habit all the time." I stood up quickly, mumbling something about needing to return to my cell for personal prayer time. Father Thomas smiled and told me he looked forward to our next session, but there was something in his tone that made me feel sick to my stomach. I walked back to my room on shaking legs, my mind racing with confusion and fear I didn't know how to process. I couldn't shake the feeling of Father Thomas's hand on my head, his fingers lingering in my hair, his words about my habit echoing in my mind as I lay in my cell that night. The crucifix on the wall seemed to stare down at me, and for the first time, I felt like I couldn't meet its gaze. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that he was a priest, a man of God, and I was just a nervous girl misreading kindness. But my body knew something my mind didn't want to accept. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and my prayers felt like they were hitting the ceiling instead of reaching heaven. The next week, Father Thomas asked me to meet him again after Vespers. I wanted to say no, to make an excuse, but the weight of obedience pressed down on me. In the convent, you didn't question your superiors. You didn't say no to a priest. So I went, my heart pounding as I walked to that small office by the chapel. The lamp was already on, casting those same long shadows across the floor. He was sitting at the desk, his Bible open, but he didn't look at it. He looked at me. "Helen," he said, his voice soft but heavy, "you're doing so well here. God sees your devotion, but there's more he asks of you, more he expects from those he chooses." I didn't know what he meant, but the way he said it made my skin crawl. He stood up, walked around the desk, and stood closer than he ever had before. I could smell the starch in his cassock, the faint tobacco on his breath. He told me to kneel again, like last time, for prayer. But this time, there was no prayer. I was 20 years old when it happened. His hands didn't stay on my shoulders. They moved deliberate, to places they had no right to be. My mind went blank, like I was watching it happen to someone else. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't listen. He kept talking, his voice low, saying this was God's will, that my silence was my offering, that my obedience was my salvation. I don't know how long it lasted. Minutes, maybe, but it felt like hours. When it was over, he adjusted his collar, sat back at his desk, and told me to go to my cell and pray for forgiveness. Forgiveness. As if I was the one who needed it. I stumbled back through the corridors, my habit clinging to my skin, my chest so tight I could barely breathe. I kept thinking about my mother's cross in my suitcase, the one she'd sewn with such love, and I felt like I'd betrayed her, betrayed God, betrayed everything I'd come here for. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my bed, clutching my Bible, but I couldn't open it. The words I'd loved my whole life felt like they belonged to someone else now. It didn't stop with Father Thomas. A few months later, Father Michael called me to his office. He was different, charming, almost gentle at first, like he was offering me a gift. He talked about my potential, how I was special, how God had a unique path for me. I wanted to believe him, to find some shred of the holiness I'd come here for. But then he locked the door, just like Father Thomas had, and I knew what was coming. He used the same words, God's will, my purpose, my duty. I was 21 by then, and it happened again, and again, until I lost count of the nights I'd leave his office feeling like a stranger in my own skin. Father Thomas got worse after that. He didn't bother with soft words anymore. He'd wait for me in the chapel or sometimes in the sacristy, his eyes cold and sharp. He'd tell me I'd be ruined if I spoke, that no one in Ashwood would believe a nun over a priest. They'll say you tempted us, he said once, his voice like a blade. They'll say you're fallen. I believed him. I'd seen how the town looked at Father Michael, like he could do no wrong. I'd seen how Mother Clara dismissed whispers about him, her face hard as stone. I felt like I was carrying a secret that would destroy me if it ever got out. Sister Agnes saw it in me, the way I was unraveling. I'd catch her watching me during meals, her fork hovering over her plate, her eyes full of questions she didn't dare ask. One day, in the laundry room, when we were alone folding linens, she grabbed my wrist. Her hands were cold, trembling. Helen, she whispered, you're not okay? I see it. What's happening? I wanted to tell her everything, to let the words spill out and share the weight. But her face was so pale, so frightened, like she already knew she couldn't carry it. I pulled my wrist away, mumbled something about being tired, and went back to folding. She didn't push, but I saw the guilt in her eyes, like she was failing me by staying silent. I didn't blame her. She was as scared as I was, caught in the same web of rules and fear that kept us all in line. Those years from 20 to 24 were a blur of shame and survival. I stopped looking in mirrors. I stopped writing letters home. I stopped feeling like the girl who'd walked into St. Mary's with a heart full of hope. I was still praying, still kneeling in the chapel every day, but it felt like I was talking to an empty room. The worst part wasn't just what they did. It was how they made me feel like I was the one betraying God, like my silence was the only thing keeping me from damnation. The days at St. Mary's started to blur together. each one heavier than the last. From 1964 to 1968, I was caught in a cycle that felt like it would never end. It wasn't just Father Thomas or Father Michael anymore. There was another priest, Father Joseph Carney, who came to the convent in '66. He was older, with a gravelly voice and hands that shook when he held the chalice at Mass. But he was no different. He'd call me to help with chores in the rectory, moving books, cleaning the altar linens, and then the door would close and his hands would find me. I stopped counting how many times it happened. It was easier to let my mind go numb, to focus on the sound of my own breathing or the creak of the floorboards, anything to pull me away from what was happening. I kept waiting for someone to notice, for someone to see the way my hands trembled when I passed the wine at supper, or how I'd flinch when a priest's shadow crossed my path in the corridor. Mother Clara, with her sharp eyes and tighter lips, saw everything in that convent. She knew when a sister missed a prayer or left a dish unwashed. But when I tried to talk to her, just once in the spring of '65, she cut me off before I could get the words out. I was in her office, my voice barely above a whisper, trying to say something about Father Michael, about how he made me uncomfortable. She leaned across her desk, her rosary beads clicking against the wood, and said, "Sister Helen, you're imagining things." A good nun doesn't let her mind wander to such dark places. Focus on your prayers, not your doubts. Her words felt like a slap, like I was the one doing something wrong just for thinking it. I left her office feeling smaller than ever, like I'd been caught stealing from the collection plate. The weight of it all started to hollow me out. I'd lie awake at night, the convent so quiet I could hear the wind rattling the windows, but sleep wouldn't come. My thoughts would spiral. Maybe Mother Clara was right. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was the one who misunderstood God's will. I'd kneel by my bed, trying to pray, but the words felt like ash in my mouth. The Bible on my desk stayed closed. I couldn't bear to open it anymore. I started to wonder if God had turned his back on me, if I'd done something to deserve this. The girl who'd walked into St. Mary's with dreams of serving him felt like a stranger, someone I'd lost along the way. I tried to talk to Sister Agnes again, maybe a year after that first time in the laundry room. It was late summer, '66, and we were in the garden picking tomatoes under a gray sky. I don't know what made me try again. Maybe it was the way the air felt heavy, like a storm was coming, or maybe I just couldn't carry it alone anymore. I told her about Father Thomas, about the locked doors, about how I didn't know what to do. Her face went pale, and she dropped the tomato she was holding. It split open on the ground, red against the dirt. "Helen," she said, her voice so low I could barely hear her, "you can't say anything. The church will destroy us. They'll say we're lying, that we're the ones who sinned. We'll lose everything." Her eyes were wide, like she was pleading with me to stay quiet, to save her as much as myself. I wanted to scream that I was already losing everything, that I was disappearing inside myself, but I just nodded and went back to picking. After that, she stopped meeting my eyes during prayers. It was like she was afraid to see me, afraid of what she'd have to admit if she looked too long. I started writing letters to my family late at night when the convent was silent. I'd sit at my desk, the candle flickering, and pour out everything I couldn't say aloud. I wrote to my mother, telling her about the priests, the shame, the way I felt like I was drowning in a place that was supposed to be holy. I wrote about how I missed her apple pies, how I wished I could come home and be her little girl again. But I never sent them. I'd fold each one carefully and tuck it under the mattress, where no one would find them. Years later, after I left, someone found those letters, yellowed, creased, the ink smudged from my tears. They're the only proof I have that I wasn't imagining it, that it all really happened. By 1968, I was 24, and I felt like I'd aged a lifetime. The convent, with its stone walls and endless prayers, felt like a prison. I'd look out my window at Ashwood below, at the houses with their warm lights, and wonder how the world kept going while I was falling apart. I didn't know how much longer I could stay, but I didn't know how to leave either. The priests, Mother Clara, the rules, they'd wrapped themselves around me so tightly I couldn't see a way out. But something inside me was starting to shift, like a crack in the ice, letting a little light through. I didn't know it then, but that crack was the beginning of my escape. By the summer of 68, I was 24, and the convent felt like it was closing in on me, the walls heavier each day, the air thicker with secrets I couldn't speak. I'd stopped praying altogether, not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't find the words anymore. My faith, the thing that had brought me to St. Mary's, was slipping through my fingers like sand. I'd walk the corridors, my footsteps echoing, and feel like a ghost in my own life. That's when I heard about Sister Mary. I didn't know her well. Sister Mary Callahan was older, maybe 30, with a quiet way about her, always keeping to herself during recreation. She'd been at the convent longer than me, but we'd never spoken much beyond a nod in the chapel or a shared glance while scrubbing pots in the kitchen. Then, one day in June, she was just gone. Her cell was empty, her few belongings cleared out, not even a note left behind. Mother Clara said she'd been called to serve at another convent, but the way she said it, clipped like she was reading from a script, made my stomach turn. I overheard two older sisters whispering in the laundry room, their voices low, saying Mary had been troubled, that she'd left in disgrace. But the way they glanced at each other, quick and nervous, told me they knew more than they were saying. I started asking questions, carefully at first. I'd linger near the older sisters during garden work, hoping to catch a stray word, a hint. One day, Sister Ruth, who'd been kind to me when I first arrived, let something slip while we were weeding. Mary was like you, she said, her eyes fixed on the dirt. Too trusting. She wouldn't say more, but it was enough. I started piecing it together. Mary's late-night trips to the rectory, the way she'd stopped smiling, how she'd flinch when Father Michael's name was mentioned. I realized she'd been through what I was going through, and whatever had happened to her, the convent had swept it away like dust under a rug. It hit me like a wave. I wasn't the only one. Knowing that made the shame burn hotter, but it also lit something else inside me, a spark of anger, small but stubborn, that refused to be snuffed out. I couldn't keep going like this, letting them take pieces of me night after night, letting Mother Clara's cold stare make me doubt my own truth. I had to do something, even if it broke me. So one evening, in late August, I went to Father Michael's office. My hands were shaking so bad, I could barely knock on the door. He was sitting at his desk, his glasses perched on his nose, a stack of papers in front of him, like he was just another man doing his work. I stood there, my voice barely holding together, and said, "Father, what you're doing to me, it's wrong. It's not God's will. It has to stop." My words sounded small in that big room, but they were mine, and saying them felt like pulling a splinter from my soul. He didn't even look surprised. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing, and gave me a smile that made my skin crawl. "Sister Helen," he said, his voice calm as if he were giving a sermon, "you're confused. You think anyone in Ashwood would believe a disgraced nun over me? If you speak a word of this, I'll make sure everyone knows what you've done. Your family, your friends, they'll see you for what you are." He stood up then, walked toward me, and for a moment I thought he might hit me. Instead, he leaned close and said, "You'll lose everything, and no one will mourn a girl who turned her back on God." I don't remember leaving his office. Only the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as I stumbled back to my cell. His words clung to me like damp cloth, heavy and suffocating. I sat on my bed, staring at the crucifix on the wall, and realized I couldn't stay. Not another day, not another hour. The convent wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was a cage, and if I didn't get out, it would swallow me whole, just like it had Mary. That night, I made my decision. I waited until the convent was silent, the sisters asleep, the only sound the faint creak of the buildings settling. I packed my suitcase, the same one my mother had given me, with her cross still sewn into the lining. I left my habit folded on the bed, the black cloth looking like a shadow I was finally stepping out of. I didn't take much. My Bible, a few photographs, the letters I'd written but never sent. I slipped out through the kitchen door, the one we used for deliveries, and walked down the hill into Ashwood. The town was asleep, the street lights casting long shadows, and I kept walking until I reached the bus station. I didn't look back at the convent, not once. I was 24 years old, and I was leaving everything I'd known behind, carrying nothing but my shame and a tiny flicker of hope that I might find myself again someday. I left St. Mary's Convent on a cold March morning in 1968. I had no plan, no destination, just a desperate need to get as far away from that place as possible. I packed the few belongings I had brought with me 4 years earlier, my grandmother's Bible, some photographs, and a small bag of clothes. I walked down that same hill I had climbed with such hope and excitement, but this time my legs felt heavy, my heart empty. I took a Greyhound bus to Pittsburgh because it was the first ticket I could afford with the small amount of money my parents had given me before I entered the convent. The city felt overwhelming after years of quiet corridors and predictable routines. The noise, the crowds, the constant movement, everything seemed too much, too fast, too bright. I found a small room in a boarding house run by an elderly Polish woman named Mrs. Kowalski, who asked no questions about my past and seemed content to let me pay my rent and keep to myself. Finding work wasn't easy. I had no real job experience outside of the convent, no references I could use without explaining where I had been for the past 4 years. Eventually, I found a position at a small Catholic elementary school on the south side of Pittsburgh. The irony wasn't lost on me. After fleeing one religious institution, I had ended up working for another. but I needed the income, and teaching had always appealed to me, even during my time at the convent. Working with children became my salvation in many ways. Their innocence, their curiosity, their simple faith in the goodness of the world around them helped me remember that not everything about religion was corrupted. I taught third grade, helping 8-year-olds learn to read and write, watching them discover new ideas and ask endless questions about everything from mathematics to why the sky was blue. Their laughter filled spaces in my heart that had been hollow for so long. But the damage from my years at the convent ran deeper than I realized. I couldn't enter a church without feeling physically sick. The smell of incense would trigger memories that made my hands shake and my breathing become shallow. I stopped attending Mass completely, something that would have horrified the young woman I had been before entering the convent. When my students asked why I never joined them for school masses, I would make excuses about having other duties to attend to. At night, alone in my small apartment, I would try to pray the way I had learned as a child, the way that had once brought me such comfort and peace. But the words felt empty, meaningless. I would start reciting familiar prayers and find myself stopping mid-sentence, unable to continue. Sometimes I would cry for hours without understanding exactly why the tears were coming. I lived this way for over 30 years, working, keeping busy, avoiding anything that might trigger the memories I had buried so deeply. I dated occasionally, but never seriously. The idea of intimacy, of trusting someone completely, felt impossible. I told my family I had decided religious life wasn't for me and left it at that. They respected my privacy and never pressed for details, though I sometimes caught my mother looking at me with worried eyes. Then, in early 2002, everything changed. I was watching the evening news when a story came on about allegations of abuse within the Catholic Church in Boston. As the reporter spoke about priests who had violated their positions of trust, about victims who had stayed silent for decades, about a church hierarchy that had covered up these crimes, I felt something inside me crack open. The faces on the television could have been my own men and women, now middle-aged, speaking through tears about experiences that mirrored mine exactly. They used words I had never been able to say out loud. Abuse, manipulation, betrayal. They talked about shame that had eaten at them for years, about faith that had been shattered, about silence that had protected the guilty while destroying the innocent. For the first time in over 30 years, I realized I wasn't alone. It took me 3 years after watching that news report to work up the courage to do anything about it. In 2005, when I was 60 years old, I found a survivor support group that met in a church basement in downtown Pittsburgh. The first time I walked through those doors, my legs were shaking so badly I had to sit down immediately. There were about 12 people there, men and women of all ages, sitting in a circle of folding chairs under fluorescent lights. That's where I met Laura Bennett. She was about my age, with kind eyes and calloused hands from working as a seamstress her whole life. During her turn to speak, she told us about a priest in Erie who had abused her when she was 14. The way she described the shame, the years of silence, the way it had affected her relationships. It was like listening to my own story told by someone else. After the meeting, we walked to a diner and talked until 3 in the morning over cups of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. Laura was the one who convinced me to file a report. She had done it 2 years earlier, even though her priest was already dead. It's not about punishment anymore, she told me. It's about the truth. It's about making sure they can't pretend it never happened. So I went to the district attorney's office in Allegheny County and told my story to a young prosecutor who listened without judgment and took careful notes. Father Michael Dunn died in 1998, Father Thomas Reed in 2001. There would be no trial, no justice in the traditional sense, but there would be a record. The hardest part was deciding whether to go public. Mother Clara was still alive, living in a retirement home for nuns outside Philadelphia. She was 89 years old and, according to my research, had never faced any consequences for what she had allowed to happen at St. Mary's. Laura helped me write a letter to the Ashwood Tribune, the same newspaper that had once written glowing profiles of Father Michael. The editor, a woman named Patricia Walsh, agreed to meet with me. When my story ran on the front page in October 2005, it split Ashwood right down the middle. Some people reached out with support, former classmates who remembered me as the devout girl who had dreamed of becoming a nun, neighbors who said they had always wondered why I had left the convent so suddenly. But others weren't so kind. I received letters calling me a liar, people saying I was just trying to get attention or money from the church. One man stood up during a town council meeting and said I was trying to destroy the memory of good priests who couldn't defend themselves. The hardest criticism came from people I had once considered friends. Mrs. Henderson, who had taught Sunday school with my mother, told the newspaper that I had always been troubled and attention-seeking. Even some members of my own family questioned why I was bringing up something so old, why I couldn't just let sleeping dogs lie. But for every person who doubted me, there was another who believed, and slowly other stories began to surface about St. Mary's, about Father Michael, about the culture of silence that had protected predators for decades. It's been 15 years since I first spoke out, and I'm 80 years old now. The anger that burned in me for so long has settled into something quieter, something that feels more like acceptance. I've learned that healing isn't a destination you arrive at. It's something you work at every day, like tending a garden. Some days are harder than others, but I've made peace with the girl I was and the woman I've become. The hardest lesson was learning to forgive myself. For years, I carried guilt about what happened to me, as if I had somehow invited it or deserved it. Laura and the other survivors in our group helped me understand that I was never to blame. I was 19 years old when I entered that convent, trusting and faithful, believing in the goodness of the people who were supposed to guide me. I was a victim then, but I refuse to remain one now. I'm a survivor, and that makes all the difference. About 5 years ago, I started attending a small Methodist church near my apartment. It's nothing like the grand Catholic masses of my childhood, just a simple building with wooden pews and clear windows that let in natural light. Pastor Williams is a woman about my daughter's age who speaks about love and forgiveness in ways that don't make me feel small or afraid. I can pray there without my hands trembling. I can sing hymns without my voice catching in my throat. I've found my way back to God, but on my own terms this time. I spend most of my time now working with other survivors. I speak at conferences, meet with people who are just beginning to tell their stories, answer letters from men and women who have carried their secrets for decades. Just last month, I talked with a 45-year-old man who had been abused by his parish priest when he was 12. He cried when he told me he had never spoken about it before, not even to his wife. I held his hand and told him what I wish someone had told me all those years ago, that his voice matters, that his truth deserves to be heard. The work isn't easy, and some days it feels like we're fighting an ocean with a teaspoon. But every person who finds the courage to speak changes things, even if it's just for one other person who hears their story and realizes they're not alone. That's how healing spreads, one voice at a time, one truth at a time. People sometimes ask me if I regret entering the convent, if I wish I had made different choices when I was young. The answer is complicated. I regret the pain I suffered and the years I lost to shame and silence. But I don't regret the path that led me here, to this moment, to this work. My experience, as terrible as it was, has given me the ability to help others find their way out of the darkness. Silence protects the guilty. That's something I learned too late, but I know it now with absolute certainty. For 50 years, my silence protected Father Michael, Father Thomas, Mother Clara, and everyone else who allowed the abuse to continue. But my voice, our voices, they have power now. They can't change what happened, but they can make sure it doesn't happen to others. And that, I've discovered, is enough reason to keep talking, to keep telling the truth, no matter how much it hurts. My voice is my power now, and I'll use it until the day I die. If you've listened to my story all the way through, I want to thank you. I know it wasn't easy to hear. It certainly wasn't easy to live through or to tell. But if my words reached even one person who needed to hear them, if they helped someone realize they're not alone in their pain, then every difficult moment of sharing this has been worth it. Maybe you're someone who has carried your own secret for years, who has wondered if anyone would believe you if your voice matters. Let me tell you something I wish I had known when I was young. It does matter. Your truth matters. Your healing matters. And there are people out there ready to listen, ready to help you carry the weight you've been bearing alone. Or maybe you're someone who loves a survivor, who wants to understand how to help but doesn't know where to start. The answer is simple. Believe them. Listen without judgment. Let them tell their story at their own pace, in their own way. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is simply witnessing their truth without trying to fix it or explain it away. If my story has touched you in any way, I ask you to share it. Not for me, but for the people who still haven't found their voice, who are still trapped in that silence that almost consumed me. Every time we speak openly about abuse, about trauma, about the long journey toward healing, we make it a little easier for the next person to step forward. Please subscribe to Grandparents Archives for more stories of courage like mine. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. Together, we can amplify voices that need to be heard, stories that need to be told. We can make sure that silence no longer protects the guilty and that survivors know they have a community ready to support them. No one should have to suffer in silence the way I did for 50 years. Your support helps us share these important stories and create space for healing and truth.